So we're going to talk a little bit about Rwanda and Uganda, sort of separate them out into two different presentations, just because I have this pet peeve about us lumping countries together when they actually operate quite differently from each other. But here I'll just be focusing a little bit on like an update for Rwanda and then at the products that you'll see on the table. So production and our partners and then the products. This year, again, we come to the wonderful topic of price. Just to give some information on what we have experienced this year compared to the previous year. So in 2021, there was already quite a big hike on the minimum price set within Rwanda for cherries. So it was at 250 Rwandan francs for per kg of cherry that small producers all over the country will deliver to washing stations. And NIAB, which is the agricultural board in Rwanda that governs all of the agricultural production of agricultural products, set a new minimum in 2022. Oh my God, I'm going back 2 years. And that was around 410 Rwandan francs per kg of cherry. So it's a massive increase for all of the participants in the supply chain of coffee. And it's quite complex in a country like Rwanda, where not like Brazil at all. There are many parts of the supply chain that are very necessary in order to have an end product that's exportable, because most of your producers are small producers scattered across the country that are growing up until cherry, then delivering cherry to another part of the supply chain that's processing coffee that then delivers or uses the service of a dry mill and then delivers to an exporter. So each of those parts of the supply chain are very important and necessary, and if you work with good people and good companies, it should be a good partnership across that supply chain. But of course, increased costs anywhere in that supply chain, increase risks, and make it harder to operate when there's so many people who are going to potentially impact the quality of the coffee. Competition, this is a large part of why price has been very challenging. The government in Rwanda sort of tends to make a lot of laws or has new endeavors in regards to coffee. It's a very, very small country, and coffee production is a huge part of its GDP and the income for a lot of families across the country. So they are working from one perspective all the time to try to manage coffee as a whole within the country, to promote it as a quality product, that Rwanda is capable of producing a high quality product, but also to see that the impacts are sort of carried through down to the people who are producing the coffee and the people within the country, and those are positive impacts. So things like increasing price, things like mandating certain regulations around coffee. So over the last couple of years, they have created a law that you as a washing station are not allowed to buy coffee from further than a certain radius from your site. I don't remember what it is, I'm sorry. But whereas before, you could, if you had a washing station and you had trucks, you could drive all over to collect cherry from producers that you had a relationship with, or who were doing a good job, or if there was low production in your direct region at that moment. So that you could have enough volume to move through your washing station to also make it profitable. They've also allowed, it's quite open in some ways, so building washing stations and owning washing stations privately is very normal and very possible. So what often can happen is that an area that's doing quite well in terms of production and quality and has a good name for itself in terms of the export or international market, there can be an influx of people wanting to set up washing stations in that area, but nobody necessarily looks at what's the production capacity for that area and how many washing stations versus how much cherry is able to be produced in that area, and sort of thinking about it from that perspective. So what happened across 2021 was that a lot of washing stations were built in one small area in the west of the country, close to Lake Kivu, and so it became very overpopulated with buyers of cherry, and not enough cherry, not enough growers, or growers not growing enough volume, so that it was very possible for price to be quite high, because the producers could demand higher prices, otherwise they'd just go somewhere else. And as a washing station, you need to process a certain volume to make yourself profitable in terms of costs. So that happened in the west, where we buy a lot of our Rwandan coffees from, and we saw that the price in that area this year, while the minimum price was like around 410 Rwandan francs per kg of cherry, the general price being paid was actually more realistically around 600. In that area, it was 700 to 850 Rwandan francs per kg of cherry. So these coffees become much more expensive. That's much more challenging for washing stations to make a profit and manage their operations. Volume as well, like as I said before, depending on the number of producers in an area and the ratio of like volume that they will produce to washing station can have a big impact on whether a washing station is a cooperative or a private, its ability to actually be profitable to manage its production. So that's also an important part of what we have seen happening this year. In general, this year the volumes have been have reported to be, the season is not entirely over, so we don't have like a good full perspective of what volumes have been exported, but it was believed to be like a higher volume of production than last year. But most of the washing stations that we work with actually had less volume because of this element of competition. So they couldn't access the same level of volumes that they have had in previous years, which also makes it challenging for them to make money. It means that they basically need a higher per kg price for their coffees to be sustainable. So then, if there's are there any other questions about like Rwanda and its production in general, not specific to our partners and how we're working there?
Out of interest, you spoke about kiwi. How much coffee comes across the border?
Oh, I think it's impossible to tell, but a lot. I mean, DRC has amazing coffee. It's just a very sort of warped supply chain of getting them out. So both in Rwanda and in Uganda, you see a lot of coffee coming over the border. And in Uganda, there's even like people we've come into contact who drive over the border to pick up the coffee to bring it back and process it. So for sure, there's a mix. I mean, a lot of it's also difficult because it's like on the border, on those border towns and areas where you're setting up processing, the coffees are almost like the same area. These like definitions of border are very like, Western like ideologies around this. But in terms of if you are a people or you're from this area, you're probably it's kind of interchangeable in a lot of ways, and so is the coffee. But of course, it's complex if we want to understand an individual country as a separate entity.
Question actually with the Rwanda specifically.
Mm-hmm.
You get a lot of these Rwandan coffees with potato. How do you guys go about that? Is it something that is, let's say for example, that is inconsistent back to back, or is it a consistency thing, or is it like a whole lot thing?
So I think in my experience, any of these kind of quality issues with coffee are dramatically impacted by increase in production. So both on a farm level and at a washing station level, a lot of the defects that we see, the higher the volume being produced, usually the lower the ability to manage for these kinds of defects and to be sure to eliminate them. So it varies a lot from year to year, depending on this like volume of production, both in terms of like what's being produced on the farm and how are the cherries being picked in terms of when they're ripe or being left on the tree, because it's also very bad for development of disease. It's like overripe cherry on trees or dropping on the ground for insects and stuff, but also the production at the washing station, and then also like the process of like being able to cup and sort through what coffees could potentially be problematic or not. I think Rwanda has improved a lot over the years still, even though you're still going to find potato every now and then. We found less and less, but it's also hard to tell, right? If you go back maybe 4 or 5 years, we were invested in a washing station in Rwanda in the south, and so we used to work at a much higher level in terms of volume that we were buying, but also volume that we were cupping through, because we were producing our own coffee, so we had to cup each day lots to understand the quality of that, how we should sort of differentiate products and create products from what we were producing. So when you're cupping at that level, your perception of level of potato is going to be probably higher, because you're going to be exposed to more coffee in general, so you're going to be exposed to more potato. So it's difficult to tell. I think over the last 3 years we've had lower volumes from Rwanda for a couple of years, because it is challenging to work with in other ways in terms of getting coffees shipped on time. So it's a bit, I have a perspective that it's getting better, but like I said, it can be very specific to what your experience is.
Is it, let's say for example, if you guys, let's say, for example, 100 bags, right? Would you get some potatoes in those bags?
Often not at all.
Not at all.
Yeah. And what
It's
we
the
will
same
do,
lot.
our procedure, so maybe a better way to answer the question is, so our procedures would be, we work with partners who we have seen and know how that they're operating, both with the producers around them or on their own farms and at their washing stations, and with a miller who's at a high level in terms of structural operations they have for milling coffee. We will receive samples from these kinds of suppliers. We will cup through and select lots, and we will cup a wider range of cups often. If any of the coffees have potato, we will recup a full roast of that coffee. And then we will, if there's no more potato in the second cup, well, it depends also how many cups are in the first cupping. So
I suppose you guys do 5 cups?
usually 4, and if any potato, we would do like another roast and then do the full roast, which is a bit more than 4. I can't remember how many cups it is. And then we'd also often include the leftover from the first cupping. And then if there's more potato, if there's like a minimal amount of potato, like maybe there's 1 cup across your whole cupping, then you also look at, okay, we would look at, okay, what is the relationship with this supplier? What is the value of the coffee outside of that cup that cupped with potato? But I can say in most instances we will reject a coffee if it shows any potato, just because it's so off-putting. And if you think of a client receiving that in like a coffee drinker receiving that in a coffee shop, it's like a totally different experience of coffee that's totally bizarre. So it's not often that we will take a coffee, but we will weigh that up because it is relevant, you know. Sometimes you find, it's like the same with phenol, or sometimes you find the most amazing coffees and there's just like, you know, there's 1 cup, so you have to decide what's more valuable to you. But with the potato, most of the cases we will reject the coffee. And then it will be for our supplier, like if it's at PSS level, to offer us like an alternative lot from the volume that they're producing. Any more questions before I move on to the partners? So, as I said, like Rwanda is a place that we've worked quite intimately with and for quite a long time. Our relationship with the coffees and the volumes that we're buying have varied over the years. It's a very small country, so the different profiles that you get across the country don't vary as dramatically in some other countries or other parts of the world. It's also a country that has relatively good access for people to go and work directly themselves if they have the right volume. And we try to work in places where we can add value. So when we first started working in Rwanda, of course, it was very different to what it is now in terms of development of the product and production, but also we were pretty early on starting to like manage our own washing station. However, we've seen that there's still like a demand from our clients to be engaged and involved with these coffees, and we have bought from Mahembe and Gitesi for like the entire time of our existence. So we have a very, very long relationship with both of those washing stations. They are washing stations that are privately owned. Mahembe is owned by a gentleman called Justin, and Gitesi is owned by Ame and his father. And they are both doing like a really good job. Coffee Village and Ibisi are like newer washing stations that we started working with in the last couple of years. Also to diversify like at what time and where our volumes are coming from, because of course like any production sort of happens over a period of time, but you also want to try to optimize like filling a container with the right kind of coffees in as quick a time frame as possible to like ship coffees, especially in a place like Rwanda, because one of the major problems we've had is like timing on shipments. So that's been very complicated. NIAB, the National Agricultural Board I was talking about, they have very strict rules around like paperwork for like releasing coffees from Rwanda, because what has to happen is the container will come to Rwanda, will get stuck, there's a whole lot of paperwork before it can be exported, and then it has to travel overland to either Dar es Salaam or Mombasa. So it has to cross borders internally in Africa, and that's very complicated with coffee. And so that is very challenging because that process takes quite a long time, and they won't start or do it until you have like everything in the container and everything approved for shipment. And so that's where a lot of the delays are often caused, as well as Dar es Salaam, which is the most commonly used port for Rwanda coffee, is a very busy port, so it can be very challenging if there's anything happening there. So we've had a very good year this year, but we've often had like issues with timing of arrivals, and that's what's made it hard to grow our volume. from Rwanda. What we have focused on doing is doing like different kinds of products from the country. So Mahembe, as I said, this is owned by a gentleman called Justin. He owns it privately and is doing a very good job of processing coffees, and has also worked with us to produce the kind of coffees that we are interested in. So at first, when we were working with him, it was like he's on the west by Lake Kivu, and it was very sort of different profile from what people were buying from Rwanda, because back then no one was really working in the west, and most people were buying coffees from the south and from Rwanda, which is like lots of red fruit and kind of juicy and rounded. These were more like sort of delicate and sort of herbal and less like heavy fruit coming through. Just some images of the cherry picking and selection. And then processing. I'm not sure how much sort of you know about Rwanda, but it's very traditional, like washed coffees. So the cherries are pulped. There's more and more eco-pulpers now, but traditionally it was more like disc pulpers. And then fermented, as in the top picture. Then washed through these channels and graded by density, and then dried and sorted. It's very common in Rwanda for them to dry first under shade, because you can more easily, when they're wet, you can more easily pick out the defective beans. So they would be under the cover for like a day, and then go out into the normal traditional raised beds that you've probably all seen. Then Gitesi. So Gitesi is also in the west, and they're really impressive. Ame is like a young engineer who then went back to work with his father at the washing station, and they also have their own farm, and they have done a lot of work with the community and in like the structure of their washing station, and with water filtration to make sure that the water that comes out of processing coffee that goes back into the ground is like fully filtered and clean and safe, which is obviously impressive when you don't often have resources. Well, these kinds of operations don't often have resources to focus on things like that. But I think also it kind of speaks to the education that he got and was able to then like re-input back into his family's business. There's just some images, as I may, of what it looks like to be in Rwanda. And these are the traditional raised beds that you'll see coffee drying on. So traditionally, like natural coffee, when Rwanda started to, as a country, started to work to produce coffee at a higher level, and Cup of Excellence was starting out there and wanted to show that like Rwanda could do a good job of coffee production. It was like illegal to plant anything but red Bourbon and to produce anything but fully washed coffees. This in a lot of countries is because like traditionally natural coffees would have been the way like coffee, when it was like a product not thought or cared about, would have been produced, and just in a very bad way. And that's why they don't want it to be done anymore, because the connection to this kind of production is that, oh, this is going to be like cherry dried with no control on like plastic sheets on the ground by the side of the road, or even like not on plastic sheets, and then that's going to sort of like impact the overall value of the coffee in the international market. Now we see that it has changed because of demand, and so you can, as a producer or owner of a washing station, you can get permission to produce coffees in these different ways. Some people started doing it before, it was on the sort of quiet before they were given permission, but now you see it's more possible to get permission from the government to do these kinds of coffees, and they also see that the contract values for these coffees are actually often on par or even higher than for washed coffees. It's a great thing for Rwanda because, like I said, it's a very small country, so there's not a huge diversity of profiles. There is, but it's not huge like Colombia or Ethiopia. So it's great to have these different mechanisms to create like a different or a more diverse product range. So Coffee Village is a newer washing station that we've been working with. I don't actually have so much to say about them. They are producing quite a lot of coffee, and then a slightly different time to Gitesi and Mahembe, so that's why it's helpful for us to work with them. So, as I said, like washed washed coffees are the sort of traditional production across Rwanda. So we have washed coffees from stations. That will then be a mix of deliveries of cherry from producers in the surrounding areas. We've tried at times to do like hill separations, but it's easier the more volume you're buying, and because our volumes are not so big, it's hard to consolidate production in small areas. It's quite small, and then not have it spread over too long periods of time. So that's often why in coffee, like, you're blending from different producers at this kind of level, because you don't want that you have coffee sort of harvested in May and harvested in the end of July, and then you're combining that into one lot, because the risk of that having any kind of deterioration or issues of consistency across the coffee is problematic. So that's how most of the coffees are. They are from deliveries during certain time periods from surrounding producers. Because Kitesi have their own farm, it will depend a little bit from season to season how much volume they're able to produce. But this year we have two lots from them that are just from their farm. So those should be on the table today. It's not so common in Rwanda. Then, of course, naturals. We have worked with a couple of the washing stations, as I mentioned already, to produce natural coffees, which I think actually Rwanda's a good candidate for this. They taste really good. And then, of course, the pea berries. This is something we started a long time ago. There's the natural pea berry as well, but it's mostly washed coffees. But basically, pea berries are the smaller, more dense beans. You all know what they are. It's quite common in producing countries that these are not really valorized, like, of course, Kenya, and a lot of Kenya, Tanzania, who have these auction systems that every part of the coffee production is valorized. They will have these pea berry lots, but it was not so common for places like Rwanda, Brazil, until we started to work with producers, because we cupped that these coffees actually have huge potential. So we separate these out from the coffees we buy, from the lots we buy. They sort of separate out all the pea berries when they're processing or milling the coffees, and then we create these blends of pea berries, often at a cheaper price, because they would have been a product sort of not given any value if it wasn't for us buying them. Then I'm finished.